Donald actually gets quite nasty. The house was quite often just kind of turned upside down. Bed sheets were torn, there were scratches on the walls, and stuff was smashed. Donald was apparently quite, violent, aggressive in that sense that he just kind of wrecked the home. Hey guys, back again. This is part 2 of my series on the Battersea Poltergeist. If you haven't seen the first one, please go back and watch that. And of course, major spoilers for the Battersea Poltergeist. Very briefly, this is a apparently true story of a haunting that happened in London. It's pretty much the most well-known ghost story, I think, in the UK, and was covered actually by a BBC podcast just a few years ago. Let's get right into it. So just to pick up where we left off last time, apparently Wally, so this is Walter, this is Shirley's father, was in bed and was somehow burnt, apparently spontaneously lit on fire. And both in the police reports and in the hospital reports, he apparently has some gouges, these scratches, in the burn marks that he has on his body. He had to go to hospital for this, and the police apparently took photos of the gouge marks as well, so they were real. They did happen. Now, going back to Chib, that's Harold Chibbett, the paranormal investigator by night and tax inspector by day, who has come to the family home of the Hitchings, that moves in to try and find out what's going on, ends up actually moving into the family home. So he ends up sleeping on the kitchen, on the floor underneath the table. So he's living with the family at this point as he's making his notes and trying to find out more about the poltergeist, in this case known as Donald, that is apparently living in the house. So after the last experience that the Hitchings family had with the journalists, they weren't particularly keen on having them around again. But Harold Chibbett ends up having a idea. He says, well, let's have another journalist around, but this time what we're going to do is we're going to have the journalists stay in the house. If you remember correctly from the last episode, what happened is that I think a couple of journalists from the Daily Mail ended up essentially saying to Shirley that, well, you're making the noise with your toes, or you're cracking your joints in your toes. It's called the hammer toe theory, and and the story had kind of diminished a little bit at this point. It seemed to be a little bit discredited by this story, and so they thought that they'd give it another go. Enter Joyce Lewis. Now, before I go any further, I should say to you that this, to me, was probably the most interesting part of the Battersea Poltergeist story. It's certainly, I think, the most compelling. I mentioned that, ghost stories, if you're not really a believer in this kind of stuff, if you have one person saying, oh, well, I saw a ghost and I saw some stuff flying around the house, well, it's easy to disbelieve that person. If it's an entire family, you can still make the case and say, well, the family's in on it. The family are colluding together to make up this story for fame, for attention, for whatever it is, to fool people into believing that there's some poltergeist in the house, there's, a real ghost in the house. And yeah, that's also believable. I did say in the last part that I recorded that one of the things that I found compelling about this particular case is that there are people who are outside of the family that seemingly don't necessarily seem to have a reason to be corroborating what the family are saying, and are saying some quite fantastical things. So let's get into the night that Joyce Lewis spent sleeping in the same bed as 15-year-old Shirley Hitchings. Now, Shirley has mentioned that her experiences with the journalists up to this point have not been particularly nice. She was 15, 16-year-old girl, I think 16 at this point. And, she mentioned in the last part that, she tried to leave home to go down to a friend's house who was 2 doors down. And, she was essentially being harangued by a bunch of men with cameras and snapping photos and asking her questions. And she kind of turned around and ran home crying. And sort of, quite similar with the thing that happened at Fleet Street at the Daily Mail offices. It doesn't sound like she was particularly happy with those two men as well. And so what ended up happening is that Joyce Lewis gets involved, and she meets Joyce Lewis. And the thing that she says about Joyce Lewis is that, well, Joyce seemed quite nice, She was a bit young. I think she was in her early 20s at this point. So, I guess you're a 16-year-old girl. You're going to find it a little bit easier to, I guess, relate or trust or get on well with a, woman in her young 20s. So Joyce and Shirley seem to get on. So, we're off to a good start because Joyce is going to be sleeping in the same bed as Shirley. And when Joyce gets into the bed, she ends up holding Shirley's two hands and apparently putting her legs over Shirley's own legs, so that, of course, if Shirley is doing something, I don't know, pulling the covers down or what have you, doing something with her hands or feet that up to this point nobody's noticed, then, well, Joyce will know. And there's kind of a question at this point, I guess, with all of the journalists, and this is the case with those two Daily Mail journalists, that, well, if you can discredit the story and you can find the cause of the noises, the taps, the banging, or things flying around or what have you, then, you probably got a pretty good story on your hands. And I'm guessing that, whoever the journalists are, they're going to be coming to it with either one, in one mind or another. They either believe that this is real or they believe that this entire thing is a hoax. And so Shirley mentioned, and this is when she was interviewed in that BBC podcast a few years ago, that the reason why she was holding Shirley's hands and why she had her legs over Shirley's legs is because, she didn't entirely trust Shirley just yet, because up to this point, it looks a hell of a lot like, well, Shirley is a teenage girl who likes attention and likes making things up about a ghostly lover who likes to, court her with taps and answer questions and is apparently in love with her. Because that was one of the things, if you watch the last part, that was mentioned. They have a conversation with Donald, and Donald apparently taps twice to say that, yes, he is in love with Shirley. And so let's get into how that night began and where it ended up. Now, Joyce Lewis did end up writing her article that was released, and I'm going to be quoting it near enough word for word so that you can hear exactly what she said and what her night was like when she slept in the same bed as Shirley. Midnight had just struck, with the light still on, the door wide open. We settled down. My notebook and watch were under my pillow, stifling thoughts of rushing out and catching a taxi home. The time, 12:15. 12:22. The scraping becomes more violent. My spine chills as the blood-curdling noise moves to a spot by my pillow. So some scraping has started. And Shirley, of course, at this point is kind of used to all of this. They've been living with Donald for a number of months now. So Shirley seems to be sort of saying, well, this is kind of the beginning. This is the way he kind of makes his presence, Donald, that is, the poltergeist, makes his presence known. And that, it's going to get a hell of a lot worse. Now, I did fail to mention, by the way, that Joyce didn't come to the Hitchings family home by herself. Down the hallway in the house was sleeping her boyfriend, who was Steve. Now, Steve was a sergeant with the local police. So, if she's going to be afraid or something's going to happen, it's fine. Her boyfriend is down the hallway, right? Things are going to be okay. So continuing on with Joyce Lewis's article from 1956. 1:20 a.m. I examined the mark on her leg, that's Shirley's leg. The skin is reddened, and there are 4 distinct marks like a nail or a claw. 1:35 a.m. Shirley has fallen asleep, exhausted. Shirley mutters in her sleep as the bed starts to bounce up and down as if shaken by a giant hand. 2:30 a.m. I am startled to feel Shirley's arms slowly go out of the bed. I pull frantically, but the force pulling her is too powerful for me. When the girl awakes, shuddering, she is halfway out of the bed. Now, once again, Joyce Lewis was interviewed for this podcast a few years ago on the BBC podcast. And the thing with any of this stuff, and I'm guessing I'm not the only one that does this, but when somebody is making fantastical claims, one of the things that you might do is to just listen to them, just hear them out for what they're saying. And I'm sort of gauging, well, does this sound like this person is real? Can I trust this person? And that's never going to be a surefire way of figuring out if somebody is telling the truth or not. But I listened to what Joyce had to say in the podcast, and at no point did I get the sense that this is somebody who's making this up, that this is somebody who is telling tall tales. You could make the argument that, well, yeah, she's kind of holding Shirley's hands and feet and the rest of it, and she's trying to kind of suss her out. You could also make the argument that it's within Joyce's interests to say that the story is true and that she saw it and she experienced it and all the rest of it. But at least when I'm hearing her speak, it doesn't sound like this is somebody who's making this up. This sounds to me like somebody who was actually deathly afraid that night. And Joyce makes the point that, well, after that story came out, and it was a big story, after the story came out, people went to her and said, oh, well, you're going to become known for this kind of thing. I guess you're going to start doing more of these. And she apparently said, no, I'm never doing that again. She did not become known for chasing poltergeists up and down Britain, or trying to make it a part of her career, or making it her niche or speciality in her journalistic career. She just decided she just wasn't going to do it again. She didn't capitalize on it. Are those the actions of somebody who's going to make up something for a story? Perhaps, but this is the part of the whole Battersea poltergeist story that I found most compelling. Because when Shirley is floating, levitating outside of the bed, she calls to Steve, her boyfriend, down the hallway. And he runs in and apparently sees the same thing. Sees a girl that, is being pulled out of bed by somebody, and they are both unable to pull her back down. So Joyce Lewis's article comes out 10 days after her night spent with Shirley, and I think it kind of revives the story a little bit. It gives it a bit of believability, I guess, because somebody has spent the night there, and apparently what Joyce did is just told the night as it occurred. Now, as if the story with Joyce Lewis was not weird enough, this is where the story takes just a really bizarre turn. So at this point, Donald apparently starts leaving notes around the house for Shirley in this kind of scribbly writing, and says some of it's a bit random. It doesn't seem to make any sense, but he's also tapping at times, and he's tapping apparently what sounds like Ferrajaka. I don't know the rest of the song. But they start seeing things like the fleur-de-lis drawn on the walls, and they start seeing crosses drawn on Shirley's headboard on her bed, and you start seeing this weird French stuff start entering the story. Chib, who is now living with the Hitchings and sleeping underneath the kitchen table at night, figures out some way to communicate with Donald that's more than just, one tap for no and two for yes, and actually begins spelling out entire words, I think, by waiting for the knocks and then going through the number of knocks that fit with the letter in the alphabet. So he's now communicating with this poltergeist in the Hitchings family home. So Shirley ends up sitting with Chib in the kitchen while he's communicating with Donald, and they just sit there and then they listen to the taps, and then Chib is kind of, I guess, transcribing what Donald seems to be saying to them, and at some point he ends up transcribing a bunch of different random shit, to put it very bluntly. In some cases he's giving out the names of certain actors on television shows or movies that they've been watching at that time, keeping in mind it's the 1950s. And he also ends up transcribing some letters. At one point, I think he spells out or he goes through the number 1720, as in the year 1720. And I'm just going to go through some of the stuff that that was transcribed by Chib, that were found in his notes later on after his death. So this is apparently from Donald, mind you. I lost in Channel my life I knew, probably referring to the English Channel. That's the body of water between France and England. Donald seems to say that he's from France and he drowned in the Channel. Unsure where that came from or what that means. But there's another letter here which I'll read out now. It says, I, Louis, killed before revolution. I was the crown. I am Donald in this age. I'm originally Louis 17th. So a few weeks ago, I ended up listening to a 2-part series on the BBC Sound app, which was about the French Revolution. And this was the time that I came across the word Dauphin. So the Dauphin in pre-revolutionary France was the heir to the throne. Of course, he would have been a boy at the time, and what happened to the French royal family would have, well, of course, they chopped all of their heads off, so none of them survived. But this Donald Poltergeist is now apparently claiming to be the lost Dauphin. So the actual Dauphin, Louis the 17th, was, I think he ended up dying. It was quite tragic, actually. If I remember correctly, he was forced to denounce his parents and to make up a bunch of stuff about them before, their heads were chopped off. And then he was just imprisoned and then I think died in some tower somewhere. But this Donald now seems to be claiming that, well, I'm the Dauphin, I'm Louis the 17th. And somehow he died in the Channel, so perhaps he escaped from his imprisonment in the tower and ended up, dying in a boat trying to get to England. This is the part of the story that is least believable to me. I have to say this, that it feels a lot like, well, the story was maybe losing steam a little bit, and to kind of try and keep it alive, you try adding some additional wacky stuff to it to try and keep it alive. So there's this French angle that's now been added, with the fleur-de-lis and the crosses on the headboard and the 1720 and, I'm Louis the 17th now. I can't believe this. And the answer that I'd sort of heard that was given on the podcast about what this might be is exactly the kind of answer that I thought they were going to give, which is that, well, some ghosts or poltergeists can kind of be tricksters, right? They can kind of sort of make stuff up and just to mess with you because they can. But this seems like a really strange sort of amateurish attempt to keep the story alive. And again, I think Chib probably just put down what he thought he was hearing. If it's going to be anyone in the Hitchings house, it's probably going to be Shirley, right? She's sort of number one prime suspect. If indeed Donald is not real and she's doing all the tapping somehow, or the banging, or doing the drawings, or leaving the notes, or what have you. But yeah, this is really the part of me that I went, well, really, this is not this is not particularly believable. And you might be thinking, well, that took you long enough to hear, given you've been hearing stories about pots and pans flying around and the rest of it. And at this point in the story, I mean, Chib is already involved, right? He's already kind of invested in this story, and this French part of this story apparently just takes over his life. He chases this down. He becomes obsessed with chasing down this lead about, revolutionary France and, the French royal family and whether or not this is Louis the 17th. And, it's quite kind of sad. And I'll maybe get into this just a little bit more, but it turns out at this point that Lily, that's Harold Chibbert's wife had kind of said to the family, like, I don't see him very much. He hasn't been around very much, keeping in mind he's been sleeping under the kitchen table with the Hitchings. And, apparently he lived in a very small house with his wife, and he slept in a separate room, or he had a bed there in that separate room, because he would stay up into the early hours, doing his research for this story, for the Poltergeist story, because he's been chasing down these kinds of stories for however long, and he feels that at this point he's found something that is significant, that he might get some sort of vindication for, because of course he's a guy who's running around chasing ghosts. So Donald, don't forget, is leaving all of these notes around the house, and some of them just seem a bit silly. They're like, oh, Shirley must dress like a lady of court. Don't worry about the expense. Seemed to be something like what was in the message. Another one was about an actor that was on TV, Jeremy Spencer, and Donald apparently said something like, Jeremy Spencer seems very sweet. It would be nice if Shirley could meet him. And at this point I was just sort of thinking, like, is this just a teenage girl who likes a particular actor on TV and wants to somehow meet this actor on television? Well, one way you could do it is by saying that it was Donald, and maybe she's the one leaving the messages. I mean, this bit makes it a little bit more difficult to kind of believe the story, I think, after the high point of Joyce Lewis's story that came out in 1956. There's then something about this actor, Jeremy Spencer, where Donald leaves a note saying, oh, warn Jeremy Spencer in 24 hours if you don't want him to get hurt. And then apparently Jeremy Spencer's car ends up turning over. I don't know what happened to him after that. But yeah, quite a fantastical part of the story, even for a story about poltergeists. Chib, by the way, at some point was in France. He went to France to chase down these leads that he's apparently getting from Donald, and is sending letters to the Hitchings family to keep them, informed of what's going on there. And Donald, by the way, apparently used to watch TV with the Hitchings. They'd be watching something and he'd be like tapping away, or maybe they'd ask him a question and he'd respond with his taps. So yeah, quite odd. It's also at this point in the story that that Ethel, that's Shirley's grandmother, that's Wally's mother, is not particularly happy. She's quite disturbed by what's been going on in the house, as is everyone else, but there's something about her in particular, perhaps because she's especially religious, and she tried to get the vicar to spray holy water everywhere, including on Shirley herself, and she's been saying prayers, and she discourages the people in the house from communicating with Donald and responding to the taps and all the rest of it. So Donald apparently really does not like Shirley, and leaves some quite unpleasant notes about her, trying to convince the family to throw her out of the house and get rid of her, and saying she looks like a beetroot and stuff like that. Now, there are points where Donald actually gets quite nasty. The house was quite often just kind of turned upside down. Bed sheets were torn, and there were scratches on the walls, and stuff was smashed, and Donald was apparently quite violent, aggressive, in that sense that he just kind of wrecked the home. And one of the things that's mentioned in the podcast is that, well, one thing that was never smashed was the TV, because apparently Donald liked watching the TV. And of course, in the mid-1950s, post-war Britain, a TV is a kind of it's a luxury item. You don't really want to wreck the TV. But Donald would regularly, wreck the rest of the house, and would tear off the wallpaper and all kinds of things. It's just one of those things that kind of stands out to me. He's still terrorizing the Hitchings family. At one point, I think on Wally's bed, it was doused in alcohol. At another point later on, it was smeared in rat poison. So all kinds of strange things are still going on in this house. And these things happen in October of 1956. And that same month, something else happens. The entire family are apparently upstairs in one of the bedrooms. I think it's the bedroom of Kitty and Wally. It's the parents of the family. And, a message is tapped out by Donald. And keeping in mind, at this point that the family are kind of used to having this entity around tapping out messages to them. And the message says, "Get Ethel, please," something like that. And also keeping in mind that Donald really doesn't like Ethel. He does not get on with her, and he apparently, in Shirley's words, he used to torture her. He used to torture her. Whenever Donald would do something in the house, she would start, saying her prayers out loud, and that would just kind of spur Donald on a little bit more. He seemed to enjoy torturing her, Shirley says. So the bit that happens next, I'm going to quote Shirley herself while she's... this is her in the bedroom with Wally and the rest of the family. So they, of course, go to get Ethel, and this is what she says. She says, "Suddenly there was a voice. It was an Irish voice of a woman. And I think John put his hand on the wall, and I was looking at me mum, and we could hear this voice coming from the corner. And Nan was talking to it. She recognized the voice from somewhere. She was shaking. For a few days after, she went up to her flat, and she wouldn't even come down to watch the telly. She said, 'That's my mother's voice.'" So after this, Ethel becomes quite distressed. Ethel says that this is Sarah. Sarah was Ethel's mum. So Ethel is apparently hearing her mother's voice from the great beyond and becomes quite disturbed by it, and now begins to distance herself from the family and the home. So a couple of months later, it doesn't take particularly long for Ethel to end up having a stroke and sadly passing away. And Shirley says that she was in the ambulance holding Ethel's hand in the ambulance that picked her up and took her away that night 2 months later. But she spent those last 2 months quite disturbed by what she'd heard, apparently, in that room. And, according to the Hitchings family, the entire family heard that woman's voice that was speaking to Ethel. So this is the autumn of 1956. And the family at this point are quite used to all of the weird stuff that's going on in the house. I guess you'd have to be if you're going to be living there. But media interest in the story is not what it once was. The papers are not pushing it so much as they used to now. I should mention that at some point on the podcast, they actually get a handwriting expert in to look at the handwriting of both Donald and Shirley to try and determine if Shirley is the one who is writing, Donald's notes. Is it her? And after some suspense and making you wait a little bit, then the handwriting expert sort of goes through reasons why. But the short of it is that she believes that the letters both from Shirley and from Donald were written by the same person. She says something like she has a 99% sort of confidence that they're written by the same person. Meaning that, well, according to at least this one expert, Shirley is the one that was writing the notes that they were finding around the house from Donald. And Shirley is confronted about this. She's asked by the podcaster, Danny Robbins, well, what do you have to say about this? That this handwriting expert is saying, well, that the letters were written by the same person. She says, well, no, it couldn't have been me, unless he was taking me over. Which is quite a scary idea, she says. And of course, that was kind of the response that I expected of, well, hey, if you were somebody who was making this up, and it turns out that this handwriting expert says, well, actually, these were written by the same person that these other letters were written by, your response would be, oh, well, maybe I wasn't conscious. I didn't know that I was doing it. Whether or not you believe that is entirely dependent, I think, on where you're coming at this story from before you even heard it in the first place? Is it possible that Donald was sort of, I don't know, possessing Shirley and then making her do all this weird stuff, or is it the case that this is just a teenage girl who likes the attention, who likes the drama, who likes whatever she's getting from creating Donald? One of the things that apparently Chib did, by the way, when he was in the house, is he would take one of the rooms and then take the keys for that room, and then take that key home with him, so that nobody else should have access to that room. And apparently notes would then appear in those rooms as well, even though nobody should have a copy of the key for that room. So make of that what you will. Now, keeping in mind that this entire saga apparently lasted 12 years, in 1964, the family moved out of that house, though apparently Donald followed them in the same way that he followed Shirley to the Fleet Street Daily Mail offices, like they continued to hear the tapping there, but the activity, shall we say, the phenomena had gone down, so it wasn't going on nearly as much. In March of 1965, Shirley ended up marrying her boyfriend, Derek, and as far as I know, there really wasn't anything after that. The phenomena seemed to sort of stop, not too long after that. And of course, at this point, the media are no longer interested in this story. Going over what happened to Harold Chibbett towards the end of his life, I think he died 4 days after his 78th birthday from a heart attack. And, I don't know if Harold Chibbett had any children, but of course he had a wife. And as I mentioned, Lily had already said that, well, he's not home very often. And this thing had kind of consumed his life. And it was this point in the podcast that I kind of got a really bad feeling in the pit of my stomach. Because I thought, if this was a hoax perpetrated by 15, 16-year-old Shirley, Harold was the kind of guy that was like a moth drawn to a flame for this kind of story, and it ended up taking his life, consuming his entire life. He ended up going to France a number of times. He was at the library constantly. He was researching this, and the book that he wrote never got published, and he kind of died in ignominy. He didn't get the recognition that he was looking for. He didn't get the vindication of his life's work as somebody who was investigating the paranormal, and may have found this fantastic sort of new historical fact that apparently the Dauphin, Louis XVII, died in the Channel, and that the person in the tower was not the Dauphin, and that he's come across this new special knowledge. Of course, Chib is invested in this. He would like for this story to be true, because if the story is not true, then he has wasted his life's work. Is Shirley a kind of 15, 16-year-old girl who has just taken this a bit too far, to the point where this 50, 60 plus year old man has dedicated his life to it and now wasted it on a silly hoax? Is that what's gone on here? Now, as this story draws to a close, because there isn't too much of a sort of a nicely wrapped up ending, as I said, the family moved out of the house in 1964. Shirley eventually gets married to Derek and moves out to someplace in the south of England. And although there's a bit of activity for a couple of years or something, it's much less than it used to be. And there's nothing in the south of England, by the way. There's no activity there. She doesn't deal with anything there. And eventually she nobody has heard from Shirley. No more messages, no more scrawling the walls, no pots and pans flying around, no spontaneous fires, no Shirley being pulled out of bed, no nothing. At some point it just kind of stops. And Shirley apparently says that, well, she didn't want to talk about it for so long, and she didn't necessarily want to look at the stuff that Chib had, because she was afraid that it would come back. She says it was quite a traumatic experience for her, and that there was a lot of crying, and she was afraid, and she didn't want Donald, and she didn't want all of this. So just at some point, it just kind of peters out. But there are just a couple of extra sort of bits of the story that I thought were worth mentioning. So one of them is that Shirley says that when she was still a teenager, she was out with a friend in town and they saw a very beautiful diamond choker necklace. And Shirley was with her friend and Shirley said, "Hey, look, that's so beautiful. Isn't that beautiful? Isn't that amazing?" And they kind of point at it, they look at it, they're gawping at it, but eventually they leave. And Shirley says that when she got home, Wally, her dad, found the choker at home. And this is the only other example in the story of something that sort of had appeared in one place and then ended up somewhere else, or had appeared somewhere or disappeared. And so Wally asks Shirley, "Well, where did you get this from?" And Shirley says, "Well, it wasn't me. I don't know where it came from. We saw it in the shop, but I didn't bring it home." And so Wally apparently is quite angry and makes Shirley tell him, "Well, which shop was it? We're going to go there right now." So they go to the shop and, they produce the necklace, and the shop owner himself is deeply unhappy about this and is apparently about to call the police. So the shop owner agrees apparently with Shirley that, well, he saw the girls looking at the diamond choker necklace but never saw them come into the shop, and so agrees not to call the police and essentially says, "Just never come back here again. I never want to see you again." There's another story of Shirley, because at some point she got a job at Selfridges, and it was a time at Selfridges when they were still doing things like alterations to clothes, so you're changing them for fit or for size. Apparently, scissors would go missing and Shirley would get blamed for it, and she was accused of stealing scissors. And again, this is another one of those stories that, well, you could say, well, Shirley is just kind of making this up because this sounds like a very, very weird story. At some point in the podcast, somebody emails in or calls in and says, "Well, actually, my sister would have been working in that Selfridges around about that time. She was working there for a long time." And his sister apparently had a story to tell about this. So this guy's sister, her name is Margaret, and she apparently has had a stroke, so she can't relate this story to the podcast herself. But she asked her brother to do it instead. So you hear him on the podcast itself. And apparently what happens is that the bobbins on the sewing machines would sort of move a few inches and then they would fly off. There were scissors flying across the room, bobbins flying across the room, of course the scissors going missing as well. Margaret apparently, according to this guy on the phone, says that when he mentions the name Shirley Hitchings, she has no idea who Shirley Hitchings is. But she does apparently remember those things of random objects flying around a Selfridges alterations department. This is just another one of those moments in the story where you're thinking, well, here's this random person who's not in the family, would not be privy, you would think, to the machinations of a 15, 16-year-old girl and her family, who are trying to convince the world that they're being haunted by this scary poltergeist called Donald. And there's a final story here that, that seems to kind of corroborate what was going on, at least with the Hitchings family. So there's a gentleman by the name of Bill. So this was Shirley's cousin, and Shirley at one point stayed with her aunt. So Bill, of course, was there with his dad as well. And he says that Shirley got into the bed, and it was a metal bed frame, and he started hearing this kind of clanging. He likened it to a spanner being hit on the bed frame over and over again. And he says he couldn't tell how the noise was being made. But he looked around and he couldn't see anything that indicated that Shirley was doing it. And so at some point what happens is that the bed covers and start being pulled off, and he accuses Shirley of doing it, and she says, "No, it wasn't me." And so the bed covers are being pulled off, and so he tries to grab them. I think his dad was there as well. So these are two men trying to keep the bed covers on and they can't do it. And then you've got this banging on the bed frame too. And he said that eventually it was too strong and that they had to let go and that the bed covers were pulled off. He says at first that, he didn't believe the story and he thought it was bunk. But, after he saw that, he absolutely believed it. He said he mentioned it to some colleagues at work and they thought, oh, yeah, right, Bill. They thought he was making stuff up. But apparently, according to him, this was real. This happened. So how else to end this, guys? As I said, I mean, if you came at this from one perspective when it comes to ghosts and poltergeists and the rest of it, then yeah, I don't know that this story will have changed your mind. Maybe it has, maybe it hasn't. Do let me know in the comments. What do you think? Please also like, share, subscribe, all the rest of it if you like this kind of content. Is this something that was made up by Shirley? Could she have done it herself? Is this something that required the entire family to be in on it? What about the people outside of the family? What about this guy whose sister apparently worked at Selfridges and saw bobby pins and scissors flying across the room? What about, as I said, Joyce Lewis? I think that's the most compelling part of the story. This journalist with her policeman boyfriend, who sees her being dragged out of bed and can't keep her in the bed. Harold Chibbett, is this a man who's deluding himself? Or is this like a 15, 16-year-old girl who's taking advantage of a man who kind of needs to believe this because his life's work has been built on this up to this point? What do you think happened? Is there any part of this story that changes your mind? Would you like to hear more ghost stories, or what kind of stories would you like to hear? Please do let me know, guys. Have a good day. I hope that you enjoy your Halloween as it comes up, and take care of yourself. Goodbye.